Good. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. And I'm from Salisbury CND, and I'd like to thank Abingdon Peace Group for this cooperation, because it's very nice to organise this together. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Andy Stirling from Sussex University. Many of us will have followed the work of Andy and his colleague, Dr. Philip Johnson, as they explored the links between the UK civil nuclear power industry and the military requirements for nuclear engineers and infrastructure. They highlighted this hidden driver for the UK government's apparently irrational support for civil nuclear power. Their conclusions were vigorously denied by politicians, and it's only this year that a massive political U-turn has occurred. There are important implications for the UK's energy strategy as we struggle to combat climate change. There are implications for the ways in which democracy itself operates, and there are very large consequences for electricity consumers, as we all unwittingly pay part of what should perhaps explicitly fall within the military budget via our inflated electricity bills. So this is a topic that touches all of us in many ways, and we very much look forward to learning more about it. So if I could hand over to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks very much for the kind words, and thanks very much to you and the Sally and members of the Abingdon and Salisbury groups. I really appreciate the invitation and everybody being willing to dedicate some of what should be a boisterous Tuesday evening to these more solemn discussions. But I do, as you said very nicely, Peter, I think it's quite important, and I hope to be able to convey that to the group. And I won't assume, because I know that actually there's historically been an interesting divide between those people who are motivated by concerns about military nuclear technologies and those people motivated by concerns about civil nuclear technologies. One cannot assume crossover. There is, of course, important crossover, but so I'm going to make this presentation tonight not assuming anything and not taking anything for granted about what positions people have, how much they might know, and I hope that's useful. But I really look forward to the discussion, which we'll come to after about 35 minutes, if that's okay. And please just give me a shake if I need, if there's anything I'm missing. I'm very happy to respond during the course of it, Sally or Peter, if you think there's something going awry. So let's share some slides, the inevitable slides, but I hope they help. As you mentioned, all the work I'm going to talk about today, I've done with my colleague of many years at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit, where I'm based at the University of Sussex, Phil Johnston. So he and I have done this work in various forms over the years, as you mentioned, Peter. And I'm going to come to the point of what's occurred this year, but it's interesting. It's plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, because everything's changed, but nothing's changed, and we'll come to that. So yeah, we're going to look at these military influences and break it down bit by bit. And I guess the best place to start is with just how strange it is, the intensity of UK government commitments over the years for nuclear power, despite the evidence that they themselves have produced about it. One doesn't have to take a position pro or con nuclear power to see that statements made by ministers, and the same has been true of Labour governments as well as the Tories. But let's just look at over the last few years. Greg Clark in 2010, there is no limit to how much new nuclear capacity the Conservative Party is prepared to build in the UK. No limit is a kind of interestingly profligate kind of notion for a political party liking to remind people of their concern for expenditure. And then more recently, Amber Rudd said, investing in nuclear is what this government is all about for the next 20 years. And given the number of different pressing issues on the government agenda, it really is quite interesting that senior figures in both major parties seem to feel bound to make this kind of unqualified statement about their commitment to nuclear power. The questions are never whether or not nuclear power should be pursued. It's how much of it, how fast, because it's seen to be an imperative. Why is this such an imperative for British governments? That question can arise to anyone, no matter what one's view might be of nuclear issues generally. So let's then take a look, because I'm not assuming, as I mentioned, that people here are all aware of or share views about the economics and the other strategic reasons for civil nuclear power. Because one easy answer to the question I just posed about why governments are so committed is, well, nuclear power is just quite simply essential. We have climate change, we need base load power, and if you read a typical selection of almost daily newspaper coverage in the UK, not in other countries, interestingly, certainly not in Germany, which is the best record of success on nuclear issues, but in the UK, we seem to be just treating it as self-evident. Nuclear is a zero carbon option, wind doesn't blow all the time, we need it, it's cheap. Now let's just break that down a little bit, because it's really extraordinary how that kind of basis for supporting civil nuclear power is completely erroneous. Nuclear power it's beyond doubt now. There is no credible body of expertise anywhere in the world which argues that nuclear is not more expensive than renewable energy, both wind power and solar power, increasingly also offshore wind power. The contracts mandated in the UK for Hinkley Point C are £128 per megawatt hour. Offshore wind contracts now being signed are at £40 a megawatt hour. So we're talking about less than 1/3 of the price being paid. It isn't speculation, it's not cost benefit analyses, it's not levelized cost analysis. This is just the contracts being signed. And energy efficiency, demand management measures, reduce carbon emissions even more cheaply than wind power. So there really is no room for debate, even though the British newspapers and policy debates seem not to take this seriously at all. If people who like graphs, here's one that shows quite graphically, it's from Lazard, a merchant bank, renowned for their hard nose about these kinds of issues, least cost of energy analysis. You don't have to worry about all the detail here, but you can see how the cost of renewables have come down massively in recent years, and how the cost of nuclear power has gone steadily, gently up. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just in the UK. Nuclear costs have risen 26% over the past decade. Wind power costs are down 70%, and solar costs are down nearly 90%. So it's not only the case that existing contracts make a difference of 1 to 3 in the wholesale costs of nuclear compared to renewable energy, but the trends are all going in the wrong direction for nuclear as well. That gap is growing rapidly. Now, we also hear a lot, especially in the UK, again, as I mentioned, not in Germany, not in many other countries, but in the UK, about base load power. The fact that the wind doesn't blow all the time, so we therefore need a complementary means to manage those fluctuations. Well, that is, of course, true, but there's many different ways of securing that complementary power. And actually, nuclear power is very bad at it. It's always been known that it's bad at it. This very feature that you can't move nuclear power up or down with oscillating demand means it's not really suited. It's not just supply oscillates, it's demand as well. Here is another graph. I hope these things are useful after the fact. I'm very happy to share my slides if anyone wants to make them available to others. But this chart is from the Royal Society just last year, where it was very interesting to see this hitherto very pro-nuclear power member of the British establishment, the Royal Society, confirming that you see the higher cost, that vertical axis is costs, the higher curve shows you the costs of a high nuclear contribution electricity system for the UK over a course of a period of years, modelled into the future with all kinds of disruptions to wind blowing in the winter and all the rest of it. The middle curve shows a mix, and the lower curve shows the costs of a mix, a UK electricity mix with no nuclear power at all. And that just shows quite graphically, according to the Royal Society, using old, very favourable data from government about nuclear costs, that it's not just the cost is low, you cannot make any amount of nuclear power on the system be anything other than more expensive. So this is completely refuting the idea about baseload power in the voice of the Royal Society, that other forms of storage, electricity storage, hydrogen storage, other available technologies at their current prices already do a better job in complementing wind. So we're not talking about variable wind, we're talking about firm renewable power available with the aid of batteries and other sort of long-term storage using hydrogen. And even the government's own figures acknowledge this. So this data I mentioned comes from people like Lazard, from contracts, from the Royal Society. Here we see the government's own figures. The last time they published data on their own estimates of the costs of civil nuclear power, it was in background documents. They don't publish it, make a big song and dance about it. But here we saw that the figures for onshore wind starting at £56 a megawatt hour, large scale solar at 53, offshore wind at 69, and then the cost of nuclear power starting at 84. So again, the government's own data, which is by comparison with international figures extraordinarily favourable to nuclear power, still confirms the basic picture that you cannot base a case for nuclear power on the economics or on the base load and other considerations that are typically mentioned by government ministers, for instance, when talking to the press. So the mystery deepens then. If you delve into the background, it's simply not the case. Why is it that there is this extraordinary commitment to nuclear power when we have such a poor record? Well, this is where we have to start looking on the nuclear side of the military side of the nuclear commitments in the UK. And it's interesting, we can recognize a kind of commitment that I'm talking about on the civil side there. Ernest Bevin said of the acquisition of the UK atomic bomb in 1946, we've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. And the bloody Union Jack on top of it, he said rather graphically. Winston Churchill, a few years later, when making a decision about acquisition of thermonuclear weapons, fusion weapons, said in the face of it, similarly eye-wateringly high costs that the British government never made public, but he said of it, according to Peter Hennessy, we must do this. It's the price we pay to sit at the top table. And this is very important, I think, for a country with its sensibilities, post-colonial identities, especially in elite British politics. We see this kind of, sorry, there's some sort of blockage taking place on my computer. Anyway, we see this kind of elite identity, especially that the British must sit at this top table, the permanent membership of the Security Council, which is informally, not formally, seen to be associated with possessing nuclear weapons. If you don't have nuclear weapons, you don't get a permanent seat on the Security Council, and the British think it's our rightful place to be on that permanent position. Now, there's a whole bunch of documents that over the years Phil and I have gone through and submitted to parliamentary inquiries and various press reports and so on to try and underscore the evidence that exists. It's really extraordinarily large. But just to take you through some of the more graphic elements of that evidence, we have, for instance, at one point in 2007, early in this process, an executive from BAE Systems, the principal manufacturers nowadays of the British nuclear-propelled submarines. I'm sorry, I'm just having difficulty with a strange window popped up. I'm not sure why. It's a different computer I'm using, so it's blocking some of the text. Anyway, BAE Systems, a guy called Gavin Ireland, an executive there, wrote for RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. So feeling he was addressing a military audience, he said, nuclear submarines suffer criticism because their through-life costs cannot be absorbed or masked by other programs, as can be the case with fast jets or large standing land forces. So there you see a little glimpse into the kind of discourse going on behind the scenes within the military nuclear industrial complex, that the idea is to mask, the word they use is to mask the nuclear program, the military nuclear program behind other programs, in other words, behind the civilian programs. And we saw, courtesy of Rob Edwards, the a fantastic independent investigative journalist based in Edinburgh a few years ago, a Freedom of Information request was a particularly juicy document from MOD talking about how they need to think of more imaginative methods to better engage with the emergent civil new build program on nuclear matters so that it benefits defence. They need to leverage the maximum effect of civil nuclear investment for defence purposes, and they want to be utilising other nuclear facilities, including those on the civil sector. So it's very clear how the government itself, when it's addressing itself in behind the Official Secrets Act, discusses the issues. Rolls-Royce in 2017, for a short period until they seemed to be slapped down, issued a report. They got a little bit over-enthusiastic, and they talked in their report about the need to relieve the Ministry of Defence of the burden of developing and retaining skills and capability on the military side. So what they were saying was, let us build small modular nuclear reactors, supposedly for civil nuclear power. That will keep us in business and subsidise the cost of the submarine reactors that we, Rolls-Royce, also build. So there you have it, very clear as well. So then in other government documentation, we see a similar sort of pattern. When questioned by the Public Accounts Committee, arguably the principal body of government with the responsibility of investigating these matters and spending of money, because if money is being transferred on this scale between the civil side and the military side, that would be a very big breach of good accounting practice in the public accounts. So you'd expect the Public Accounts Committee to take some interest in it. Phil Johnson and I submitted evidence to the Public Accounts Committee detailing, as it stood then in 2017, the case. And Meg Hillier, the chair of the committee, took the opportunity to ask Sir Stephen Lovegrove, as he was then, he's now Lord, as happens when you get involved in these matters, I think, and with the success that they've had. Stephen Lovegrove was asked, we've heard from Sussex, said Meg Hillier, that what you're doing here is simply transferring resources from electricity consumers to the military. And he said, in answer to that question, we're completing the build of nuclear submarines, so there is very definitely an opportunity here for the nation to grasp in terms of building up its nuclear skills. I do not think it's going to happen by accident. It is going to require concerted government action to make it happen. In other words, I'm just doing my job. Yes, I am, and I have been engineering, as he did when he was moved into the Department of Energy and Climate Change to negotiate the contracts for civilian nuclear power from EDF. Stephen Lovegrove negotiated what the National Audit Office called extraordinarily high contract prices, the ones I quoted at the beginning of this talk. And then, having done that, he moved after only 3 years back to be permanent secretary at the Ministry of Defence. So he came out of the nuclear industry, he negotiated the contracts for the energy ministry, he went back into the Ministry of Defence straight afterwards. It couldn't really be clearer what actually is the high ground that's being dominated here by the military industrial complex on these issues. It's rare to see these issues acknowledged on the energy side. So on the military side, you see all kinds of acknowledgements by the Ministry of Defence, but on the civil side, not a murmur. And when we make the argument that this is what's happening, the energy ministries of different names over the years just completely refute it and deny it without any substance. There's occasions, though, when energy ministers speak out. So the BEIS Undersecretary of State, Richard Harrington, back in 2018, did say, I want to include the MOD. This is the Energy Secretary, remember, energy responsibilities. He wants to include the MOD more in everything he does. There's an artificial distinction, he says, between civil and military, and it needs to come to an end. And he's going to do his very best to bring that about, which he certainly did seem to do. And then now the document that Peter refers to, just only a few weeks back, from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, the civil, notice the title was Civil Nuclear Roadmap to 2050. This supposedly civil strategy, amounting to 74 pages, made 31 mentions of defence, talking about civil and military ambitions needing to be realised together and the need to identify opportunities to align the two areas across government. So absolutely clear when, unusually now, this is the turnaround that Peter rightly drew attention to. And yet, strangely, when Phil and I have done statements on this in the public domain since that document, DESNZ, the Energy Ministry, has denied it. these the form is that as put by Bayes in 2021, the civil nuclear sector is separate from the defence nuclear programme, and any suggestions otherwise are simply untrue. It is a very strange Kafkaesque world in which a document will emphasise something which then the ministers will say is untrue. Just to give you a quick overview of the world background to this, again, this is a chart that there's a lot of detail in it, but it makes the point that the basic pattern we see in the UK of this linkage between civil nuclear power and military commitments is actually an international phenomenon. And whilst there are many details in this, the basic bottom line you can see from the international picture worldwide is that the leading global military powers are around the world the most committed to large-scale civil nuclear construction programs. So the biggest civil nuclear construction programs are in the military nuclear powers. There's no global or regional military power that does not hold an active history of very strong pressure for civil nuclear power, and no country, either with or planning nuclear weapons or submarines, is currently pursuing, as many countries are, a nuclear moratorium or phase out. So the correlations, whilst not perfect, because there's lots of devils in details, is very striking that it's not just the UK that has this link, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. Indeed, President Macron, there's a few anecdotes I could tell about dealings with various figures from British and French and US governments since Phil and I have been doing this work since 2017. But it was the case that the French denied it absolutely. There was a scandal in France in 2017 and 18 after the publication of our first report on it, where it seems there was an internal report in France saying we should come clean about that. A minister resigned, the environment minister resigned. There was no acknowledgement until 2020, when President Macron said, while standing at the forge that constructs pressure vessels for nuclear reactors in France, that to oppose civilian nuclear, military nuclear in terms of production and research does not make sense for a country like ours. Without civilian nuclear, said Mr. Macron, no military nuclear. Without military nuclear, no civilian nuclear. So there you have it from the president of France. So for that country, it's exactly the same. The two things are completely interdependent. And he's really referring there because he was at the place that forges these reactor pressure vessels. He's not talking about the weapons themselves, just as the other evidence I've been referring to so far is not primarily about plutonium or fissile materials or tritium, these materials. It's about the industrial base. And in the USA, many bodies, government bodies, think tanks, defense bodies have highlighted these links in the US as well. I'll give a list of them here: Energy Innovation Reform Project, former Secretary of State for Energy, Ernest Moniz, Atlantic Council, Centre for Strategic Studies, a presidential memorandum of 2018 talked about our national security relies on a robust civilian nuclear power industry. So they're really worried about where their naval engineers and nuclear trained submariners get careers after they leave the Navy. They need careers. If they don't feel confident of careers after the Navy, then they're not going to be keen to join the Navy, and they've already got quite a big recruitment problem. And so they need the civil nuclear industry for that as well. It's not just the materials and the engineering skills coming in, it's also where people go afterwards. And they put, the Atlantic Council in 2019 put the cost in the US of this interdependence at $26 billion per year. I really don't know how they got to that figure, or I tried to get it from the detail, but it raised the question, what would it be in the UK then? What would that figure be in the UK? How much is the British economy spending more than it needs to do in order to have nuclear power so that it can maintain its military nuclear industrial base? So that's how I'll close my talk, by talking about some work that Phil and I have been doing just this last few months in fact, for a project that ultimately is supported by the Foreign Office, I think. So it'll be quite interesting to see how this goes, looking at the reversibility of nuclear weapons commitments in the UK. And here it's a rather complicated chart, so bear with me because I'm just trying it out on you really to see how much sense it makes. This is an attempt to show the flows of money going through the British nuclear industrial complex, combined civil and military. So on the left-hand side, what you see are the main sources of funds. And actually, although it's very complicated, it's relatively simple where the funds come from. They either come from electricity consumers buying nuclear electricity, or they come from taxpayers. So at the top, you see the electricity consumers. Down below, you see in the middle, taxpayers on civil budgets for nuclear agencies and programs of spending related to civil nuclear activities. And then below that, you see the Ministry of Defence supported by taxpayers again on military activities. So three types of money come pouring into the nuclear system. And you can see the scale on the left-hand side. We spent a lot of effort reconciling these different things, going through all sorts of programs, checking it with peer review so far. This has been peer reviewed. And you can see the overall amounts starting out there. On the right there, you see a whole bunch of agencies. So we're tracking it through. I won't go into detail, but you see how the money that the EDF receive for the nuclear electricity, how they divide that up. You see how the different budgets, the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency, the liabilities, Great British Nuclear, United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, etc., etc. In the middle, all these agencies that are concerned exclusively with nuclear issues. And then below, you see the spending on the Defence Nuclear Enterprise, keeping the submarines going, the Submarine Development Agency developing new submarines, the Navy itself operating them, and so on. Now, a tricky bit beyond that is then plotting it through, and this has taken us the most time, again, based on published evidence in agency budgets, showing how the different activities, all the different activities are mixed up. So, for instance, decommissioning costs are met by the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency, but a lot of their money gets spent not on the civilian side, but on the military side. Likewise, research gets done. I was an advisor for the government's nuclear innovation program. Goodness knows why they asked me to do that. It's another story in itself. But you can see there how so much of the nuclear innovation gets funded, hundreds of millions of pounds, is also identified for military purposes, even though it's not explicitly labeled that. So you see these crossovers. Now, the whole point of this diagram, which I'll just finish showing you now, is this. On the right-hand side, you can see how much of this money flowing in on the left is ending up being spent on nuclear electricity provision and being spent on military purposes. The bottom is the military purposes, the top is the electricity. And in the middle, you see some other little things that come out, like radiological services for hospitals, other spin-off to other industries, and fusion research, which is a whole other topic. So what can we conclude from this? Well, here are three conclusions, and I would be very grateful just what you make of these and if they make sense, common sense to you. The first one is this. You see that difference there, the difference between what the taxpayer is spending on defence budgets, labelled as MOD, that's on the left, and you trace it over the dotted lines to the right, and you can see the actual amount of money flowing into military purposes is higher than that. It's about 2 to 3 billion pounds higher than the amount going in. That's flowed to military purposes from electricity consumers and from civilian nuclear budgets. It's the amount by which the actual spending on the military industrial base is higher than the allocations that they get under defence budgets. There's another rather smaller item here, only £500 million, which is the overheads of all these organisations. If the UK did not have a civil nuclear industry, because, as I've mentioned, civil nuclear power is so expensive that it doesn't make sense in energy terms, if the UK, like Germany, decided that this was a good reason to replace nuclear power with other zero carbon options, then we would save this money as well, in addition to the other amount, as the overheads of these joint bodies. And then finally, here is the cost of providing electricity in the same quantity as the nuclear electricity that UK gets, using the government status, so very conservative, using renewables, wind, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar power, and other techniques as they come online. The red line shows that cost. It's a smaller cost. The green bar shows you the savings that electricity consumers would make if we were to provide that same electricity from renewables with storage. So again, about £3 billion. So the conclusion from this is, and it's actually rather remarkable, that the UK economy is spending £5 billion per year more than it needs to do in order to maintain the submarine industrial base, to keep this military industrial base going beyond what the defence budget can afford. So I won't go into that anymore. I'd be happy to answer any questions there may be, and I imagine there may be some because there's a lot of detail in it. But I'll wind up and we can have a chat about the various issues that are cropped up here. The conclusions of this: the costs of the nuclear submarine capabilities in the UK are insupportable without civil nuclear infrastructure. We simply wouldn't be able to maintain the nuclear submarines in particular. The weapons, of course, are expensive, but it's the submarines where the rubber really hits the road. That the strong UK government support that I documented at the beginning of the talk for civil nuclear power at least partly reflects these military interests. Government has always known that this is the case, and it knows it especially now as the cost of nuclear goes through the roof and the cost of renewables are going somewhat through the floor. The same picture is visible worldwide, and it's officially acknowledged in some other countries, France and the USA. So this isn't primarily about what side you take in the various debates about pro or anti-nuclear power, nuclear weapons. It's just about we in Britain are ridiculously not even talking about this. The government is actively hiding these documents, this information, and as I said, when they need to make a case for combined civil and military support for skills and industrial base, they will do so in some documents. But then when it's pointed out that this involves a shared cost, they'll deny it in a very strange way that I already talked about. As the accelerating competitiveness of renewable energy makes this more and more impossible to conceal, we're getting more and more pressure on government to acknowledge this. And that's why I'm keen to, and Phil is keen and other colleagues to get this out there, because of course, people could decide if they wish, well, we'll simply spend more on the Ministry of Defence. There's a case to be made for people who are proponents of nuclear weapons to do that. And what we're trying to ensure is that when that does happen, which it must, the government will finally come clean. It really is clear for how long they have been deceiving the British public until the very last minute when they could get away with it. Because at the moment, what's going on in the UK is that military interests are driving energy strategies. It's happening outside the defence budget, off the public books, away from due scrutiny. So they're managing to fund the submarine commitments in a way that's completely unaccountable through the normal measures of good governance in the UK, which the UK supposedly prides itself on. And we reckon, Phil and I, conservatively, it could be a lot more than this, that the costs of this are at least £5 billion per year. And maybe most disturbing of all, and I'll end on this note, that over the last few years, we and a few other colleagues interested in this stuff have been really trying to draw attention to it. We've found incredible blockages in the mainstream press. We've got through in the Guardian, the Independent, the BBC, the Telegraph, but the stories we can tell about the blockages that get placed on getting this story out are really quite remarkable. Likewise, in select committees, we put evidence in. Sometimes it gets picked up, as I've mentioned in the discussions, but it's like a soundproof room afterwards. Nothing then gets discussed, despite the very high stakes involved. So really, what I think everyone on all sides of the debate can ask is, why is this the case? Why are we not able to talk about this in a mature, rigorous, democratic fashion in the UK? Because the biggest argument in the end, even though the amounts of money involved are very high, I would say are around concerns for the health of British democracy, because it does seem that there are no institutions at the moment, including National Audit Office, Public Accounts Committee, who are actually doing their job on these kinds of issues. And that, for me, is arguably the most worrying thing. So I hope that made sense, and I look forward to any comments and questions that people may have. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, and Andy. That was so interesting. Yeah, very, very clear explanation of the work you've done. Thank you. Can I just ask people if they would like to ask questions, either to raise their hand electronically or in person? And could I just start, while you're just thinking about it, could I just check with you, Andy, the way in which decommissioning costs and long-term storage of nuclear waste. I mean, it's a strange world in that we don't actually have a strategy for the long-term storage of the nuclear waste. But to what extent are the huge costs associated with that and decommissioning built into the figures you've used for your cost of nuclear?
Yeah, thanks a lot for you. So you're absolutely right about the scope for questions of those budgets. What Phil and I have done in the chart I showed you at the end of the talk is just taken official budgets. We put uncertainty bounds around them because sometimes what the actual budget is questionable, but we've not second guessed those budgets. We've not, for instance, asked, is the British system making enough provision to cover long run radioactive waste management costs? And there's very good reason to think we're not, because these costs have escalated massively over the years. Every time they're revised upwards. But we're not questioning that here. We're just taking the numbers as they're stated and adding them up.
Yes.
So that's one of the many ways in which the picture that I've just put to everyone is conservative, because it takes the government figures at face value without any questions about them. And yet there's huge scope for questions, especially on decommissioning, especially on radioactive waste management, which have escalated a lot in history, and there's no really strong basis for thinking they won't escalate further in the future.
No, that's interesting. Thank you. So who would like to ask a question? Anyone showing up on your screen, Sally?
I think I saw did somebody text a question in? Is there a?
Let's have a look in the chat. Oh no, that was just Carol Turner having to go.
Oh well, that's a
can
that's a bombshell.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what seems to me so extraordinary that, as you explained, the government has very consistently sort of denied this link despite other countries acknowledging it. It then moves to a position where it repeatedly acknowledges the link. And are you saying now it's again denying that?
Yeah, it's in different registers. There are different channels of communication, and one can almost see the imprints of the communication strategy with a slightly fanciful eye. So it has always been the case on the military side. Going back to 2005, Phil and I found a RAND corporation, a big consultancy, US-based consultancy, does work for the British as well. 2005, they were initially classified, but it was quite quickly made public, albeit not drawn a lot of attention to. That's as early as that, the RAND Corporation was saying to the Ministry of Defence, you have absolutely got to get your act together in the UK on your civil nuclear program, otherwise you won't be able to afford to build submarines. We've got problems in the US, said RAND. You've got the same problems, but they're more intense. So it was 2 volumes, something like 400 pages. Last time I checked, it was on the web still. So the Ministry of Defence then, from that document, have been consistently saying this. On the energy side, they've not only not been saying it, they've been denying it when it's put to them. And in fact, when Phil and I work in a energy research institute, a lot of my work has been done on energy research. You find yourself repudiated by, for instance, the conference of the British Energy Economics, like the French Foreign Legion, formally ripped our epaulets off and disinvited us to give a talk when they realized we were talking about military links. We got disinvited from an academic conference. There's many examples of this kind of thing, that on the energy side, there's a kind of allergy to talking about this. And when you talk about to people privately, they'll say, yeah, you're probably right, but we will completely lose our patronage if on the energy side, we'll lose our contacts if we're an energy specialist journalist, we'll lose our funding if we're an academic. It's simply toxic for us to talk about military links of the civil side. Then we see people like Phil and I coming out, putting evidence in repeatedly to parliamentary select committees. Sometimes it catches the eye of a parliamentarian. They'll raise a question. The issue will be confirmed. And then it typically doesn't go in their report. It's not refuted. They don't put it in their report.
Goodness.
Finally, there was this year, the Energy Ministry, came out with a document I mentioned, where they do issue a report, 70 pages, 31 mentions of the defence links of nuclear in there. It's a civil nuclear document. So you'd think this was a complete U-turn, and several people wrote in the press about it being such. Jonathan Porritt wrote something as well as what we were writing. And yet, in response to that, that same ministry said, no, it's not true. There's not a link.
It just seems extraordinary, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's Putin-esque.
Mm.
And, you know, on top of the fact that US presidents, French presidents, all the way down through those governments have acknowledged the same thing in the US. What is it about British public that cannot be told this? It's extraordinary.
It really is. Could I just ask you about your thoughts on the AUKUS developments, where Britain and the US are seeking to spread the use of nuclear-powered submarines to the southern?
Yeah, well, I don't want to personalize this, but I mentioned Stephen Lovegrove, now Lord Lovegrove. The lordship, I think, was earned in no small part by AUKUS. He was the architect not only of the Hinkley Point exorbitant contract prices, but also of the AUKUS arrangement. And what we're seeing, if you step back from it, it was the case already. I mean, the Swedes, the Germans, other countries are demonstrating that submarines now, in all but the ballistic missile launch role, SSBNs, so-called attack submarines, SSNs, the function of a nuclear power in an attack submarine is typically much better. The money is much better spent on these high-performance, air-independent propulsion, non-nuclear submarines that the Swedes and the Germans and other countries are making. They can make many of these submarines for the cost of one nuclear-propelled attack submarine. Now, the point is, ever since, for many decades now, all British submarines have been nuclear-propelled. So what we're seeing with AUKUS is just a continual metastasizing of its dynamic. First of all, the expense of building ballistic missile submarines with a nuclear reactor in them was so huge that you had to have every submarine has to have a nuclear reactor. You just had to share that cost of that industrial base across all the submarines you build. So that's why the British have gone for these gold-plated nuclear-propelled attack submarines, like the US does as well. But even that wasn't enough. So then we saw that they had to then keep the civil energy industry going as well. So the imprint of this military demand is also on you have to have civil nuclear power as well as nuclear propelled attack submarines in order to be able to maintain the ballistic missile submarines. But even that wasn't cutting it. They're only getting 5 billion a year, as I've documented in this talk. They need more. So you need the Australians. And the same dynamic goes on in Australia, whereby you replace non-nuclear submarines with nuclear propelled submarines. Australia is supposedly wanting to defend itself. It's only when you want an offensive capability, need to deploy your submarines offensively remote, that you start wanting these nuclear propulsion rather than the Swedish or the German style of air independent propulsion. And we've seen the same thing after the AUKUS deal. Then the current government of Australia is making a big noise about then getting civil nuclear power in order to have an industrial base to recruit its naval officers and put them back in afterwards. The same logic is playing out in Australia, but nuclear power is the tail on the dog. What's wagging it is the military submarine dog, and the nuclear energy tail is wagging away. And it's, at the moment anyway, the energy debate in Australia is incredulous. It's even more ridiculous in Australia to try and propose nuclear power. They already have, some of the territories of Australia already have firm power from renewables that's working extremely well, very cheaply, and they've got scope for it as much as they want. So it's the same dynamic, just constantly playing out in different settings.
That's very interesting. That the sort of need for a global involvement in this nonsense, isn't it? Really,
it is
extraordinary story you've told us.
Nigel, did you have a question?
Pardon? Sorry, were you talking?
Nigel, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask something?
No, I was only. Well, it's been an amazing story and shows the effect and how much the cost is, because not only are they subsidized by the civil nuclear, all the trained people, etc., but also it's affecting the rest of the military, because the submarine and the cost of it takes precedence. So all the rest of the military are suffering as well. So there must, I don't know what the total cost of the submarine building is. It must be much, even more enormous than we know.
Yeah, quite. I mean, Mary Caldor, actually a colleague from the institute I'm in, SPRU, many years ago, she's now at the London School of Economics. She wrote a book called The Baroque Arsenal. Some people may know that book, back in the 80s. And she just talked about the extent to which the deployment of military equipment cannot be explained by military needs. Often the military themselves, in general, this isn't talking about nuclear particularly, is frustrated. For instance, the Falklands War, to have surface vessels always aluminium. The aluminium on the top superstructure of the ships, aluminium is inflammable, especially under attack by modern weapons. Why would you build inflammable warships rather than steel? And the reason was you have to keep it light because you've got so much kit on the top. The defense contractors pushing and pushing and pushing for more and more of this kit to be loaded on top. So she documented this sort of push. The Baroque Arsenal was a push from the military industrial complex on the military itself. And this is just an example that we end up acquiring these nuclear propelled attack submarines in order to supply, keep the industry going for the ballistic missile submarines. And not only then is the whole Navy shifted its shape in order to get the outputs of BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce and Cavendish, these big companies that make the submarines, Babcock, you're not only affecting the Navy, you're also affecting the rest of the defense budget, the Army and the Air Force, because there's much less budget for them as a result of the nuclear spend on the Navy. So, yeah, it's the tail wagging the dog.
Definitely.
There's a question from Sally Mears, and she says, what can we as civilians do about this shocking story you're telling us? You know, what actions can we collectively take to help drive the story?
Well, thanks for. I mean, I think this is two groups of people come together for this meeting who I think what you're doing really, mobilizing, communicating, conveying every opportunity you have. The way I see social change. I mean, I've worked on these sorts of issues, not just on defense and energy, but also chemicals and biotech. And I think if you look back and see what really has caused change, what made the environment movement as effective as it was, what's made the women's movement so effective, it's a bit like, it's not about getting into the cockpit and pulling the levers, getting power in some way. It's like murmurations. It's like birds or fish when they're flocking. There's this beautiful choreographed movement they're capable of, and including very rapid. When the time is right, these flocks will change direction very rapidly. So I have faith that political culture is a bit like that. And despite all the adversities there are in the world at the moment, it really matters that people are doing the kind of day-to-day grinding activity that you guys are doing and many people around the country are doing. It really matter. So keep on doing that and take every opportunity to just persuade other people, bear witness, provide evidence in a sort of as persuasive way as one can. I think that's what it takes, and that these things will change. They have changed in the past, and they will change on this too.
It is a massive house of cards, isn't it? That is built on these crazy assumptions, really. And
yes,
I do think the distortion of our country's energy policy is really an awful part of it.
Yes,
well.
I do too. I think there's another. I don't know if it's motivating or disabling, really, but there's a mystery that goes beyond the boundaries of the UK. I mentioned the international picture. Do you know what about the only Russian industrial sector that has not been sanctioned is?
Yes, uranium production, I think, is it?
Yeah, it's nuclear services from Rosatom. Rosatom are the Russian firm maintaining their main mission on their website is the maintenance of the Russian nuclear weapons capability. And it is Rosatom is the only large company Russian company not sanctioned in the US or Europe. You have this very strange phenomenon that the British are, every time they get a new piece of kit, naval kit especially, they put it out to the South China Sea. They're very explicit about wanting to be a mini-me alongside the US, challenging China. So China is in that sense an adversary for the aircraft carriers, also the submarines. But when they are desperate to maintain the civil industrial base in order to build those submarines, they need nuclear power stations. They can't get funding or even contractors for them. So they actually deal with CGN, China General Nuclear, to build the Bradwell power plant, which is in the pipeline at the moment. It's going off a bit now, but it's been there for many years. So you actually have, again, the manufacturers of the Chinese nuclear weapons, a major prospective contractor for the civilian nuclear program in the UK, whose main function, if you find our analysis persuasive, is military to challenge the Chinese. Now, at first I spent ages thinking, what is going on here? This is really peculiar. And then it kind of makes sense for me, the analogy with gangland culture. In cities, gangs, cities that are riven with gangs, we see in Haiti at the moment, it was a case in New York a few years ago, when they're overwhelmed with gangs, the gangs are killing each other, so they're each other's adversaries. But the real enemy is the people of the city, and especially through the local government, who can now and again come together and get these gangs in order. And I think increasingly the nuclear complex around the world is behaving like organized crime. Its main problem is getting enough money to keep itself going from its own populations. In order to do that, it needs to scare them with the threats from the other populations. And the actual business of challenging each other with this deadly force, which of course is horrifically violent, is not actually the only relationship. They have more in common with each other than we suppose.
Yeah, I mean, well, what an extraordinary evening, I would say. Thank you very much for your insights and very clear explanations. I think that was wonderful.
Well,
so
thank you.
Let me hand back to Sally to just tell us how the rest of the evening will go, because I know for the Abingdon Peace Group there's other stuff to be done. So
I think, Anne, did you want to say something? You're muted, Anne.
I just wanted, Andy, if you could say a little bit more about, you mentioned the problem of almost attracting the attention of a parliamentarian to actually get the whole thing out and highlighted. And the difficulties of getting the attention of the press. You mentioned the Guardian, the Independent, and the Telegraph. And could you say a bit more about what that depends on? Whether it's, have you got certain journalists who you know will, as it were, are on your side, or how does that work?
So I think it's random. You just keep slugging away, and it's random chance. We wrote. I keep quite a diligent record. 19 leading energy specialist journalists. 17 of those 19 were very eager at the beginning to take up the story, but all 17 found themselves blocked by various things. They either said they said the editorial desk had stopped them. Either it's a conspiracy theory or everyone knows it. The most common reasons were contradictory. Either everyone knows it or it's a ridiculous conspiracy theory. This was going back over some years now, this sort of toll of 19. So this is what happens to specialist energy journalists. But I think I didn't work it out at the time. I was a bit slow. They are the most sensitive to patronage. So whether it's a D notice, they're now called DESNZ notice, I think. I don't think it is, but I think there's a sensitivity to losing privileged information from their departments that they need to get information from. The people who have covered it over the years, and as I mentioned, all the broadsheets and the BBC and a lot of other coverage, a lot of coverage internationally, New York Times, Washington Post, Frankfurter Allgemeine, Tageszeitung, but also all the major British main broadsheets have covered it now quite well, but none of it was by an energy journalist, always by investigative journalists. And often quite free-thinking ones, maverick ones. Ambrose Evans Pritchard in the Telegraph did a lovely piece, very favourable about nuclear weapons, but horrified about this deceit that we've been talking about tonight. So it's what's he called? Roger Harrabin, the correspondent for the Today programme. I was supposed to go up there to do a thing on it at a point when it reached a pinnacle of interest a few years ago. Then it was cancelled very shortly beforehand. So, you know, but that can happen anyway. But then he later then did it on the website, and he told me we'll avoid the gatekeepers. We'll put it on the BBC website because you get past the gatekeepers. I don't know what he meant. I didn't have a chance to have a good conversation with what Roger Harrabin meant by gatekeepers. So there is some kind of strange dynamic. I don't know how sinister it is, but it's definitely an oppressive weight inhibiting the British press from covering these issues in the way the international press does. So what we found is to just keep hammering away, because the world is a complex place. There are decent people in there, and if you just kept hammering away, then these pressures enough times do dissolve. I can't think of a better answer. I don't think there's a clever way of getting around it. You just have to keep trying.
Thanks. Thank you.
Is that Nigel's hand there?
Nigel.
I'm happy carrying on, but I know you guys have run out of. I'm always happy to talk about these issues, so I'm in your hands.
Just a very quick one, because I edit the Oxford CND newsletter, and I wondered, is it almost embarrassing to ask you, is it possible to have a small resume of everything you've been talking about to go in the newsletter? And it's embarrassing because you could talk for hours on this, I know, but is it possible to have, you know, I asked guest speakers, John Gittings, etc., so 700 words a page, you see, that's not a lot for you to condense down everything. Like, I wondered if you've already done something like that.
Yeah, I have. So thank you for asking. I appreciate it, and it's kind of you to ask. And I'm very keen to contribute wherever I can. Life is so extraordinary, and by the way, life is extraordinarily busy because of all kinds of knockback effects that we're experiencing in the University of Sussex around this work. I won't go into detail on it, but you don't do this kind of work in academia without your life being made really difficult.
I bet.
And those difficulties pile up. So my time is very stretched at the moment for reasons I'm not entirely clear exactly what's going on. But Nigel, what we do have, there's a piece in the conversation from after the civil nuclear roadmap. So the last major thing that Peter alluded to at the beginning and I talked about, that's incorporated in it. So my best shot at a few hundred words summarizing these issues was in the conversation, and the story about how that got out was quite interesting as well. A lot of blockages stopping that for 8 months. But anyway, that came out, and I can send you a link, or you can find it just like Andy Stirling, Philip Johnston, the conversation, and you'll find it. And please feel free to use it in any way you wish.
And could I email you for that?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you from Abingdon Peace Group. I think it's great the joint work or the joint cooperation that's emerging between us and Salisbury. But I'd like from Abingdon to really thank you, Andy, for your time, for your clarity. And we wish you all the best to you and colleagues in continuing to plug away and expose and get the true situation into a much wider sphere. And so every success with that. And the grassroots, no change happens, as you said, except from the grassroots upwards, as well as the levers of power at the top. So where they meet, change happens. But from Abingdon's, and thank you very much, Peter, for from Salisbury introducing the whole evening and our speaker. Thank you for all those who've come. Could we just a sort of round of applause to Andy, even though we may not be heard as most of us are muted.
I was born in Salisbury, but I'm in the Abingdon group.
Ooh.
And I just want to bless you, Andrew. in Jesus' name with your work, and may
thank
you
you.
be protected. Amen.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.